Okay, let's unpack this. I think we've all been sort of conditioned to believe that if something is real,
Hmm.
if it's truly important, it must be something we can measure, something we can categorize, and ideally reduce down to a set of laws.
Right.
We think of the brain as this incredibly complex biological machine, don't we? That thinking is just, information processing.
A very sophisticated form of it, maybe.
Exactly, maybe really, really sophisticated logic just being executed in that 3-pound lump of gray matter we all carry around.
And that view, that very materialist, technical view, I mean, the idea that everything, including our own subjective experience, even consciousness, is ultimately reducible to something quantifiable,
Something definable.
definable, and maybe, most importantly, objectifiable. That idea is really the bedrock of a great deal of modern science and philosophy.
It gives us a sense of comfort, I suppose.
It does. It suggests that reality is, at its core, knowable
Hmm.
and controllable.
But today, and this is where we're going to start, we're kicking off with a really radical proposition.
What if one of the most fundamental activities we engage in, I mean, like having a thoughtful conversation, or even just the act of thinking itself, what if that actually refers to something that fundamentally does not exist?
As a tangible, self-contained object.
Exactly.
And that, right there, is the core of this fascinating philosophical dialogue we are deep diving into today. Our sources are these really powerful excerpts from a discussion titled Das Gehirn als Denkding.
Which translates to what? The brain as a thinking thing.
The brain is a thinking thing.
Yes.
And this dialogue, it really forces us to confront a critical philosophical distinction.
And I want to stress, this isn't just about playing word games, right? This isn't semantics.
Not at all.
This dialogue establishes a really profound separation between language, what the sources call Benenbarkeit,
Binnenbarkeit, so the capacity for something to be named.
the ability to name something, and it separates that from actual ontological existence as an object, or what's the term?
Existential sting? Existence als Ding. So they are really launching a powerful critique here, aren't they, against this modern tendency, particularly from, say, logical positivism, to treat these complex dynamic phenomena as if they were just inert, passive objects.
That's the entire project. So our mission today is to follow this argument, step by step. We really need to unpack the limits of classical logic when it's, well, when it's misapplied to living processes.
And we need to understand what that distinction between a thing and a non-thing really means for how we talk about, how we analyze, and maybe most crucially for our modern age, how we attempt to construct or replicate intelligence itself.
So prepare for a deep dive that really questions the very labels you probably use every single day.
So let's start where the source material starts, which is with a claim that, I have to say, sounds utterly absurd on its face.
It's designed to be provocative.
It is. The claim is, there is no discussion.
And of course, the immediate informed reaction from anyone listening is going to be, but wait, we're having one right now.
Of course, I can hear us.
You can look at the sound waves, you can look at the transcript later, you can even, look at the neurological activity of our respective brains. How can you say it's not there?
Exactly. I feel like I have to push back on this, as the informed skeptic here. If we can record this, if we can transcribe it, analyze it, if we can define a start time and an end time for this exchange, how is that not quantifiable enough to be called an object? Isn't the activity itself an object of study?
And that is the perfect question. It's the essential question because it forces us to clarify this crucial conceptual distinction between an object of study and an object that is a thing.
Okay.
The claim is not denying the activity. It's not denying the talking, the interacting, the exchange of ideas. All of that is happening.
So what's being denied?
What is being denied is the existence of a tangible autonomous object, what the source calls a discussion sting.
A discussion thing.
A discussion thing.
So, okay. We're dealing with a philosophical category error that's created by our own language. We have the word discussion, which is a noun, so it makes us assume there's a corresponding singular thing out there, like this microphone or the table it's on.
Precisely. If you try to define what a discussion actually is, the source defines it as an interaction of independent individuals. And you have to note the key words there, interaction and independent individuals.
Right.
We, as the participants, are communicating. We are interacting dynamically. If I asked you to point to the microphone, that's easy. It's right there. It's a passive, contained object.
Simple.
But if I ask you to point to the discussion, what do you point at? You can only point to the people.
Or the sound waves between us.
The air vibrating. all of which are parts of it or maybe traces of the activity, but none of them is the discussion as its own autonomous entity.
So a discussion is fundamentally a dynamic relationship.
It's a living process. And the moment you try to reify it, I mean, to treat that process like a static object, the inherent logic of the interaction just breaks down completely.
Okay, let's follow that thought process. So if a discussion thing, a ding, actually existed as this static, self-contained thing,
then the individual participants, you and I, would necessarily have to be mere parts of that thing.
And if we were just parts of a thing, we'd have to be things ourselves, which would imply that we're passive, we're predictable, inert.
Exactly. But we aren't. We are self-actuating. We choose what to say next. We process information internally and, crucially, independently. We can surprise each other. We drive the interaction forward based on independent agency.
And that independence is the definition of liveliness.
That's the word. The source argues that the interactions being carried out are actions, and that actions are fundamentally not thing-like. The German phrase is so direct, Handlungen sind nicht dinghaft.
Handlungen sind nicht dinghaft. Actions are not thing-like. Wow, that's a powerful distinction. If a thing is passive, it has to be acted upon from the outside.
Right. A rock doesn't decide to roll down a hill, it's pushed.
But an individual capable of independent action, of making decisions and producing results based on their own internal self-directed processes, that just defies the ontological category of a mere thing.
It does. That concept of self-actuation immediately breaks the thing analogy.
So the essential problem is that when you insist on turning the process into a thing, you immediately strip the components, the participants, of their essential quality.
Their liveliness.
Their liveliness and independence. You're trying to force a kind of predictable stasis onto something that is defined by its unpredictability and its dynamism.
And you can see this in so many everyday, non-thing examples that we nonetheless treat as objects.
Oh, yeah. Take a relationship, for instance. We say, my relationship is complicated. We're treating relationship as an existing object that has properties.
Of course. But you can't point to the relationship. You can't put it in a box.
No, you can only point to the two people and their interactions, their history, their shared experiences. It's a total non-thing process.
Or a traffic jam. That's a great one. We use the word traffic jam as if it were a physical object we could, pick up and move.
I'm stuck in a traffic jam.
Right. But a traffic jam is purely an emergent interaction of thousands of independent drivers, all acting with their own agency, but restricted by external variables. It's a process, not a self-contained object. It does not exist independently of the cars and the drivers acting within it.
That helps tremendously. Okay, so let's solidify the difference then between the process and the product in our original example. The discussion process itself is definitively not a thing.
It's a flowing activity, an emergence.
Correct. But, and this is key, the activity is productive. It produces tangible discussion results. The German is Diskussionsergebnis.
Okay, so the results are things.
In a sense, whether we reach an agreement, or we learn a new fact, or we just definitively confirm a disagreement, those outcomes do exist concretely. You can write the final agreement down on a piece of paper. And that piece of paper is a thing. The result is subject to the logic of existence and verification in a way the process itself just isn't.
Precisely.
So we have the structure, we have the living participants, which are the input, engaging a non-thing process, which is the discussion activity.
Which then yields a thing-like result.
The outcome, which we can write down and verify.
It's an elegant three-part structure. And the core insight of this source dialogue is this. Because the components are independent individuals and the discussion is their interaction, that interaction is capable of producing something genuinely new.
The emergent results.
Yes. And if we treat the discussion as a singular static object, we flatten the novelty, we eliminate the emergence, and we deny the independence of the participants entirely. We lose the essence of what is actually happening.
Yeah.
So the next step in this deep dive is really understanding why. Why does our linguistic habit of naming these dynamic processes create such deep philosophical quicksand?
Right.
And to do that, it forces us to confront classical logic head-on.
Because, okay, while the activity of discussion isn't a thing, the word discussion that we're using right now certainly is. It's a pattern of sounds. It's a collection of letters on a page, a linguistic token.
A token.
And that token itself is dinghaft, right? It's thing-like. It exists as ink on paper, as a measurable concept in a dictionary.
And the moment we have a word, a clearly defined token like that, that word is immediately governed by one of the most foundational, non-negotiable laws of classical Western philosophy and logic.
You're talking about the Satz vom ausgeschlossenen Dritten.
The principle of the excluded third.
Okay, let's dedicate some serious time to this principle because this feels like the logical engine of the entire argument.
It is.
The principle of the excluded third, often traced back to Aristotle, basically states that for any proposition, either that proposition is true or its negation is true.
There is no middle ground.
No third possibility. A thing either is or it is not. A statement is either true or it is false. Full stop.
This is the absolute foundation of the binary system. I mean, everything from formal mathematics to all of computer programming relies on this law of excluded middle. Applied to existence, it forces this clean binary. Something either exists or it doesn't.
And this principle applies perfectly to the word itself, because the word is a thing. We can say the word discussion exists in the English language, or it does not exist on this blank page. It's a clean binary, a true-false categorization.
But here is the critical collision. This is the central flaw that leads to what the source calls Sprachverwirrung.
Language confusion.
Language confusion. The word itself is governed by this clear, binary, logical principle, but the underlying reality the word points to, that complex, dynamic interaction of independent living individuals, does not fall under the principle of the excluded third.
Okay, that is a colossal claim to make about something as foundational as reality. I mean, if a discussion is happening, why can't we just say the discussion exists? Why doesn't the activity follow the law?
Because the activity is defined by flow. It's defined by interaction and emergence. An activity that involves living, self-directing components can be in a state that is neither fully existent as a static object nor fully non-existent.
It's in a state of continuous becoming.
Exactly. It's in process. Classical logic is designed for static states, for things. It's designed to categorize finished products. So when you apply that static binary logic to a dynamic flow, you lose the essence of what's happening.
So what the source is suggesting is that the actual living interaction, that moment of reciprocal influence, the creation of novelty, is itself the excluded third. It is the middle ground. It's the dynamic space between absolute existence as a defined object and absolute non-existence.
Think about the act of teaching. That's a great example. Does the teaching exist? Well, while the teacher is lecturing, you'd say yes. But once the bell rings, does the teaching still exist, or does only the result, the student's memory exist?
Is it possible for the teaching to exist in a state that is, halfway between being fully realized and completely gone? The logic starts to feel really clumsy.
It fails.
Uh-huh.
Because teaching is a process driven by independent agents, the teacher and the student.
Okay, to make this philosophical gap more concrete, let's go back to the source's contrast between the non-thing, the discussion, and an actual thing, a dingedei. Let's use the microphone again.
The microphone is the perfect counterexample. For this clear, passive, physical object, there's complete consistency.
Okay.
The word microphone follows the excluded third, right? True or false. And the physical thing microphone also follows the excluded third. It either exists on the desk or it doesn't. There's no ambiguity. It's here or it's not.
And the reason for this consistency is that the microphone doesn't act independently. It makes no internal decisions. It contains no interacting living components that are generating novelty.
It is inert matter.
Plain and simple.
So in the world of passive, inert objects, the logic that governs the word perfectly mirrors the logic that governs the object. We have consistency, we have measurability, predictability, everything lines up.
But when the word points to independent living activity like our discussion, where the components are capable of self-directed action and producing something genuinely new, this crucial consistency is, it's completely absent.
It vanishes. The word discussion follows the logic of the excluded third, but the vibrant, emergent activity it signifies does not.
And that gap, that linguistic convenience that's masking a huge ontological complexity, that's the central source of philosophical error.
Yes, the word creates an illusion of solidity where reality is actually fluid. And this illusion becomes far, far more dangerous when we scale this analogy up to the most complex and maybe the most valuable activity we know, human thinking.
So we've established that the word discussion is kind of a mask for a non-thing process. Now, let's take that illusion of solidity and apply it directly to that 3-pound clump of tissue we call the brain, using the same mapping we established earlier.
We can apply the model cleanly. Thinking itself, the process, corresponds to the dynamic interaction, the living process we were talking about.
Okay, and the products, so the conclusions we reach, the memories we form, the definite ideas we have, we call those thoughts.
And these correspond to The discussion results.
Yeah.
They're the outcome, the product. And because they're a product, they can be said to exist or not exist. They fall into the excluded third.
So a specific thought is a thing in the sense that you can capture it definitively in a sentence. I think the sky is blue. That statement is a thing.
It is. Which means that if thinking is the interaction that produces thoughts, this interaction must come from interacting brain components, neurons, networks, what have you, that act independently.
Okay.
And critically, these components, in their capacity for interaction, must also be not things in that passive, inert sense.
This is where my brain starts to glitch a little bit because the brain is physically there. We can touch it, we can weigh it, we can analyze its chemistry. So if I accept that the lump of matter is a thing, but the thinking is not a thing, how do we prevent this argument from just collapsing back into old school mind-body dualism?
It's the ghost in the machine.
Exactly. Is it suggesting thinking is some supernatural element? Are the sources providing a mechanism that's neither purely material nor supernatural?
That is the crucial pivot point of the whole dialogue. The source material is not advocating for dualism, not in the traditional sense. It's arguing for a category distinction within reality itself.
To explain that.
The brain, viewed purely as a material clump and a lump of matter, is absolutely a thing, no question. It has mass, it has volume, it has predictable chemical behaviors. It is subject to the logic of the excluded third.
It either exists or it doesn't.
Right. But if we accept the activity of thinking is not a thing, that it's a dynamic, emergent, self-directing process,
Then the logical conclusion is undeniable. The brain cannot be a thinking thing. It can't be a dink-ding.
It is a category error. To label the brain a dank-ding is to mistake the necessary condition for the sufficient cause.
the brain is the material platform. It's the orchestra stage. But it is not the music.
So if you analyze the brain solely as a passive material object, you just fail to capture the capacity for independent action and interaction that actually defines the process of thought.
You miss the most important part.
So the mechanism that prevents this from being dualism and allows for that transition from a passive thing to an active process, it must be that necessary ingredient missing from the purely material conception, and that's liveliness.
Lebendigkeit.
Precisely.
Lebendigkeit.
And we have to define Lebendigkeit carefully here. It's not just about, breathing or being myologically active in a general sense.
That's more specific.
It is. In this context, it is the fundamental capacity for self-determination and independent action at the component level. The source states it very plainly. A material clump, an inert thing, is not capable of thinking. Let's focus on those components for a second. So if the individual neurons or the neural networks were merely passive, predictable things in the classical sense, just reacting to input with some predefined output.
Like a simple circuit.
Right. Then they could only generate predictable results. They couldn't generate the non-thing activity we call thinking.
Correct. Lebendigkeit means the neural components aren't just passively reacting to input, they are acting independently. They are initiating novel pathways that aren't reducible to a simple input-output mapping. That capacity for self-directed, independent action is what breaks the analogy of the brain as a passive machine.
So it's the difference between, say, a rock and a complex organism. I mean, both are made of matter, but only the organism is capable of self-actuation, of deciding its own movements and purposes.
Exactly. And thinking, therefore, is not a property of the passive material object, the brain thing, but an emergent property of the self-directed interaction that is enabled by liveliness.
It's a magnificent process unfolding on a material platform.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So to look at the material brain and declare it a ding, a thinking thing, is to confuse the instrument with the composition or the stage with the performance. You have the matter, but you don't have the agency that utilizes that matter.
And this directly challenges the common intuition in certain technical fields that if you could just perfectly map and model every single electrical impulse and chemical interaction in the brain, you would have replicated thought itself.
The source would argue you would have only replicated the passive material components and their input-output results. You would have captured the thoughts or the memories.
The data.
You'd capture the data, but you would miss the self-directed activity that generated the novelty in the first place and the agency behind that data.
Yeah.
You would have the script, but you would not have the actors capable of independent performance. So by identifying thinking and liveliness as these non-things, the source material introduces some massive implications for how we use logic, particularly in any field that's concerned with construction or modeling or replication.
And the primary danger as the sources detail it, is the risk of contradiction that arises from that Sprachverwirrung we mentioned, the language confusion.
Right. We established that the word thinking is a thing, and it follows the excluded third. It exists or it doesn't.
True or false?
But the reality it refers to, this dynamic, independent, living activity, does not follow that principle. So the inevitable result is logical contradiction when you try to force the two together.
Okay, can you give me an example of that contradiction in practice? I mean, how does forcing a binary true-false categorization onto a continuous living process actually lead to confusion?
Well, think about the judicial process, or even just a simple contract. We rely on language to draw these sharp binary lines. When did the negotiation end? When did the contract become legally binding? If you try to analyze the entire dynamic process of negotiation, which is a non-thing interaction, you realize there's no single sharp point in time. It's a gradual becoming. It is. But the legal system must impose the excluded third. The contract is either binding, true, or is not binding, false. The language creates a defined moment of existence that the underlying dynamic reality simply does not possess.
So relying solely on the defined word, the ding, without checking the fluid, emergent, non-thing reality it signifies, forces us into thinking that complex living processes have to be as clean and distinct as the labels we use for them.
Precisely. We begin to mistake our linguistic map for the actual territory. And this brings us right back to liveliness as the linchpin of the whole thing.
Okay.
Since Lebendigkeit points to a process for which the excluded third does not apply, the consequences for technology are, well, they're absolute.
This is starting to sound like an absolute limit on engineering itself.
It is, according to this philosophical framework. The source argues that the excluded third must apply to everything that is built, everything that is constructed. The German word is gebaut.
Okay, why? Why must it apply to anything constructed?
Because construction requires defined components, defined relationships, and a predictable finite set of true-false operations. If component A does not exist, then its negation, not A, must be true.
Yeah.
This binary logic is absolutely essential for any kind of construction plan or blueprint.
Therefore, if liveliness is a non-thing process that fundamentally evades the binary rules of the excluded third,
It logically cannot be recreated. The German is Nachbauen. You cannot build it again using methods that rely exclusively on those binary rules.
wow. This is a massive challenge leveled directly at classical computation and, large segments of modern artificial general intelligence research.
It really is. Modern computational models, and this includes the vast majority of neural networks, they're built entirely upon Boolean logic, which relies foundationally on the excluded third. Every single calculation is a series of true-false gates, ones and zeros.
So, if the capacity for independent, self-directed interaction, this liveliness, is unconstructible because it defies the fundamental logical structure required for building things, then any effort to replicate true thinking based purely on this binary structure is philosophically flawed from the outset.
That's the argument. We can only replicate the results, not the core process.
So you can build these magnificent machines that simulate thought, that process vast amounts of data, and generate brilliant thought-like results.
The discussion successiveness.
Right, but without injecting that necessary non-thing capacity for self-determination and agency, which resists the constructible logic, they just remain magnificent pieces of inert technology.
Not truly thinking entities. They are the ultimate denk-ding fallacy.
So the critique, then, is that we are trying to build something that operates in the dynamic space of the excluded third. But we're using tools, Boolean logic, that were specifically designed to exclude that very space.
Exactly. And this leads to the ultimate non-thing phenomenon, emergence. Emergence is introduced as the pure philosophical example of something that resists categorization in the Dinghast, in the thing-like sense, where the complexity arising from the interaction is greater than the sum of the components.
And we often struggle to define emergence precisely because it operates outside the scope of that binary logic.
It resists definition, because if you try to define it, you are trying to force a dynamic, fluid reality into a static binary container. And this creates the fascinating paradox of recording emergence. The sources state that emergence cannot be completely written down or exhaustively described.
That seems like an odd constraint. Why can't we just write a very, very long, detailed book about the emergent phenomena?
Because the medium, the written text itself, is inherently Dinghaft. It's a thing. Written language, by its very nature, enforces distinct categories, defined relationships, static descriptions.
Every sentence, every defined word has to adhere to the excluded third.
It has to. The moment you fix the phenomenon onto the page, you are forcing that fluid, dynamic, self-directing activity into a rigid, passive, existing thing.
So you're capturing a static snapshot of a flow, and by doing so, you lose the essential quality of the flow that defines it as emergent in the first place.
That's right. The description of emergence is a thing. Emergence itself is not. The language is simply too rigid to capture the entire dynamic reality of the process fully. It's like trying to describe the experience of listening to a symphony by only listing the notes on the page. You miss the performance.
So the core takeaway for the listener then, the ultimate key to critical thinking here is this constant vigilance regarding the category error.
Absolutely. The important goal is always to be conscious of the category a word falls into. You have to ask yourself, does this word refer to a simple thing, a table, a piece of code, a microphone, that is passive, predictable, and consistent with the excluded third?
Or does it refer to a self-directed independent activity? A process where living components interact to produce novelty, where that consistency between the logic of the word and the reality of the process just breaks down.
It's a call to arms for critical thought. It's a warning against allowing the sheer convenience and linguistic solidity of a word to fool us into believing that the complex process it describes is a simple, passive object.
This deep dive it's fundamentally recast how we should categorize complex human and biological phenomena. To synthesize and recap, we learned that language provides us with these powerful, convenient words like discussion and thinking, which are, they're necessary for communication.
Of course.
But reality requires us to recognize that these are non-thing processes. They're dynamic, self-directed interactions driven by lebendigkeit, liveliness.
And we saw how that logical consistency that holds true for physical objects, where the word and the thing both adhere to the strict binary law of the excluded third, just vanishes completely when we deal with processes rooted in living interaction.
Right.
And this philosophical inconsistency is the root cause of so many contradictions and so much confusion when we apply classical binary logic that was designed for the material world to these fluid, emergent phenomena.
And the relevance of this couldn't be sharper today. For anyone involved in critical thinking or cognitive science or AI development, we are being cautioned that if the success of an effort relies on replicating a non-thing like lebendigkeit,
it is fundamentally unconstructible.
Unconstructible using a logic that is designed for things. You can build the hardware, you can build the algorithms, but you cannot build the agency that defies the very constraints of the construction logic.
It forces us to appreciate the difference between simulating the results of thought and replicating the process of thinking. We can create dazzling models that yield thought-like results, but without that underlying self-directed, non-thing activity, they remain technologically magnificent, but ontologically distinct from true living cognition.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to carry forward, applying this profound distinction to your own life. If thinking is not reducible to a dink-ding, to a thinking thing, and if it's living, emergent nature means it cannot be entirely captured by written logic. What else in your own inner life or your daily experience are you mistakenly treating as a quantifiable object simply because you have a word for it?
Think about concepts like love, creativity, identity, or freedom. These are all words, ding, that suggest a distinct, measurable object. But what they truly point to is a fluid, emergent, self-directed activity, a non-thing. If you cannot capture the emergent process of thinking with logic, how can you ever expect to quantify the emergent process of love? What else that is profoundly important to you is fundamentally a thing that doesn't exist. We leave you to explore that excluded third space in your own experience.